Welcome to Sinister Memory. If you're new here, subscribe now and let us know in the comments where you're listening to this story. Let's get to today's story. The maritime archives of Portsmouth yielded their secrets reluctantly, as if the very papers themselves resisted exposure to modern scrutiny. Dr. Helena Voss, a historian specializing in colonial maritime records, had spent 3 months cataloguing the deteriorating documents when she encountered the leather-bound portfolio that would consume the remainder of her academic career. The portfolio bore no external markings, save for a peculiar seal depicting a lighthouse surrounded by what appeared to be twisted vines, though closer examination revealed shapes far more disturbing in their implications. Within the portfolio lay a collection of documents spanning the years 1847 to 1851, each bearing the official seal of the British Colonial Maritime Authority. The papers consisted primarily of correspondence between various colonial administrators, ship manifests, and what appeared to be medical reports written in a cramped, increasingly erratic hand. Most intriguing among these was a detailed map of an island that appeared on no contemporary charts, marked simply as Whitaker Island, with coordinates that placed it roughly 60 nautical miles northeast of the Bermuda archipelago. The initial document, dated March 15th of 1847, bore the signature of Captain Josiah Fairweather of the merchant vessel Prosperity. His report to the Colonial Maritime Authority described the discovery of an uncharted island during a routine voyage from Charleston to Liverpool. The captain's prose, initially measured and professional, betrayed an underlying unease that seemed to permeate the very ink upon the page. He described an island of approximately 12 square miles, heavily forested, with a natural harbor protected by towering limestone cliffs that rose like cathedral spires from the churning Atlantic waters. What distinguished Captain Fairweather's account from typical maritime discoveries was his description of the island's inhabitants. According to his report, the island housed a thriving settlement of approximately 300 souls, despite appearing on no official charts or colonial records. The settlement, he noted, seemed to have existed for some considerable time, evidenced by well-established structures and cultivated fields that spoke of decades of habitation. Most peculiar was his observation that the inhabitants appeared to be exclusively women, ranging in age from adolescence to advanced years, all dressed in what he described as garments of uncommon elegance for such a remote location. The captain's initial enthusiasm for his discovery gradually gave way to a more troubling tone as his report progressed. He described being welcomed by the island's residents with a warmth that bordered on the unseemly, noting that several of the younger women had approached his crew with what he termed inappropriate familiarity. More disturbing still was his observation that many of the island's inhabitants bore a peculiar pallor, as if they had been long deprived of natural sunlight, despite the tropical climate and abundant sunshine. Subsequent documents in the portfolio revealed that Captain Fairweather had reported his discovery to the appropriate colonial authorities upon his return to Liverpool. The response from the Colonial Maritime Authority, signed by Administrator Reginald Thornbury, expressed considerable interest in the captain's findings. Thornbury's correspondence indicated that the British government had been seeking suitable locations for the establishment of what he euphemistically termed rehabilitation facilities for wayward women, and Whitaker Island appeared to present an ideal opportunity for such an endeavor. The medical reports contained within the portfolio proved even more unsettling than the initial maritime correspondence. Dr. Silas Blackthorne, appointed as the island's chief medical officer, had maintained detailed records of his observations during his tenure on Whitaker Island. His early reports, dating from the summer of 1847, described a population of women who appeared to be suffering from various forms of what he termed moral and physical degradation. Many exhibited signs of malnutrition despite the island's apparent abundance of natural resources, while others displayed symptoms that Dr. Blackthorne struggled to categorize within the medical understanding of his era. Perhaps most disturbing among Dr. Blackthorne's observations was his notation regarding the island's peculiar effect upon its inhabitants' mental faculties. He documented a progressive deterioration in cognitive function among the women, accompanied by what he described as an unnatural docility that seemed to increase with the length of their residence upon the island. His reports grew increasingly fragmented as the months progressed, his handwriting becoming more erratic, and his observations taking on an almost fevered quality that suggested the good doctor himself was not immune to whatever malign influence pervaded Whitaker Island. The final document in the initial collection bore no signature or official seal, consisting merely of a hastily scrawled note that read, "The island remembers, the island hungers. A God preserve us all from what we have awakened in this accursed place." The establishment of what colonial records euphemistically termed the Whitaker Island Rehabilitation Facility commenced in earnest during the autumn of 1847. Administrator Reginald Thornbury's correspondence with the Colonial Office revealed the true nature of the enterprise. A remote detention facility designed to house women deemed morally compromised by British colonial society. The island's isolation made it an ideal location for what Thornbury described as the necessary segregation of fallen women from decent society, while providing them opportunity for moral reformation through productive labor. The first official transport to Whitaker Island departed Portsmouth on October 12, 1847, carrying 47 women convicted of various moral offenses ranging from prostitution to adultery. The manifest, signed by Captain Horatio Blackmere of the vessel Redemption, listed the passengers with clinical detachment. Ages, crimes, and sentences served as the only identifiers for women who had been effectively erased from civilized society. Among these initial deportees were seamstresses, factory workers, and domestic servants, whose primary transgression appeared to be their vulnerability to economic desperation rather than any inherent moral failing. Dr. Blackthorne's medical reports from this period documented his initial examinations of both the new arrivals and the island's existing population. His findings proved deeply troubling, revealing that the women already residing on Whitaker Island bore little resemblance to the healthy, well-dressed inhabitants described in Captain Fairweather's original discovery report. Instead, he encountered a population exhibiting signs of severe psychological trauma, malnutrition, and what he termed a peculiar wasting condition that defies conventional medical understanding. The doctor's observations regarding the island's original inhabitants grew increasingly disturbing as his examinations progressed. Many of the women appeared to have no memory of their lives prior to arriving on the island, responding to questions about their origins with vacant stares or incomprehensible murmurings. Those who retained some capacity for communication spoke in fragments about ships that had brought them to the island years or even decades earlier, though their accounts proved impossible to verify against any official records. Most unsettling was Dr. Blackthorne's discovery that several of the island's long-term residents appeared to have aged far beyond what their physical appearance would suggest. One woman, who claimed to have arrived on the island as a young bride in 1823, maintained the physical appearance of someone barely past adolescence, despite her assertion that she had lived on Whitaker Island for nearly 25 years. When pressed for details about her arrival, she could only repeat that she had come aboard a ship called the Siren's Call, a vessel that maritime records indicated had been lost at sea with all hands in 1824. The island's infrastructure, as documented in Thornbury's administrative reports, consisted of a central compound housing dormitories, workshops, and administrative buildings, all constructed from the local limestone that gave the structures an unsettling bone-white appearance. The compound was surrounded by cultivated fields where the women were expected to grow crops for their sustenance, though Dr. Blackthorne noted that the soil seemed remarkably resistant to cultivation despite the island's apparently fertile appearance from a distance. Of particular concern was the island's lighthouse, a towering structure that predated any known colonial presence in the region. The lighthouse keeper, a man known only as Jeremiah, claimed to have maintained the beacon for longer than anyone could remember. His presence on an island, supposedly populated exclusively by women, raised questions that Administrator Thornbury seemed reluctant to address in his official correspondence. Dr. Blackthorne's attempts to examine Jeremiah were repeatedly rebuffed, with the lighthouse keeper maintaining that his duties required his constant attention and could not be interrupted for medical consultations. The daily routine established for the island's inhabitants followed a rigid schedule designed to promote moral rehabilitation through labor and religious instruction. The women were awakened before dawn for mandatory prayer services, followed by assigned work in the fields, workshops, or domestic duties within the compound. Evenings were devoted to additional religious instruction and what Thornbury termed moral education, though the specific nature of these activities remained vaguely defined in the official records. Dr. Blackthorne's reports from this period began to document disturbing changes in the behavior of the newly arrived deportees. Within weeks of their arrival, many exhibited the same vacant docility that characterized the island's long-term residents. Their letters home, when they were permitted to write them, became increasingly brief and formulaic, expressing gratitude for their opportunity for moral reformation while providing no specific details about their daily lives or conditions on the island. The doctor's own mental state appeared to deteriorate as winter approached. His handwriting became increasingly erratic, and his medical observations took on an almost obsessive quality as he documented phenomena that seemed to defy rational explanation. His final report from 1847 concluded with the ominous observation that Whitaker Island appeared to exert some form of malign influence upon all who resided there, transforming them into something less than human while maintaining the outward appearance of a benevolent rehabilitation facility. The winter of 1847 brought changes to Whitaker Island that defied both natural law and human comprehension. Dr. Blackthorne's medical journals from this period documented a series of phenomena that would have been dismissed as the ravings of a madman were they not corroborated by multiple independent sources within the colonial administration. The island's climate, which had maintained a temperate warmth despite its northern latitude, began to exhibit peculiar variations that seemed to follow no meteorological pattern known to science. The most disturbing development concerned the behavior of the island's female population. What had initially appeared to be the natural docility expected from moral rehabilitation gradually revealed itself as something far more sinister. The women began to exhibit behaviors that Dr. Blackthorne struggled to categorize within any recognized medical framework. They moved with an unnatural synchronization, as if responding to some inaudible signal that coordinated their actions across the entire compound. Their daily routines continued with mechanical precision, but their eyes had acquired a glassy quality that suggested their minds had retreated to some unreachable interior space. Administrator Thornbury's correspondence with the Colonial Office during this period revealed his growing unease with the island's operations, though he couched his concerns in bureaucratic language that obscured their true nature. He reported that the rehabilitation program was proceeding with remarkable success, noting that disciplinary problems had become virtually non-existent among the island's population. However, his private letters to colleagues hinted at developments that troubled him deeply, referring obliquely to changes in the women that went beyond mere moral reformation. The island's lighthouse began to exhibit irregular patterns during the winter months, its beacon flickering in sequences that bore no resemblance to any recognized maritime signaling system. Ships passing within sight of Whitaker Island reported seeing the lighthouse's beam dance across the waters in hypnotic patterns that seemed to draw vessels toward the island's treacherous rocky shores. Several merchant captains filed reports with the Maritime Authority describing an almost irresistible compulsion to alter course toward the island, despite having no legitimate business there. Dr. Blackthorne's medical examinations revealed physical changes in the island's inhabitants that challenged his understanding of human physiology. The women's skin had acquired an unusual translucent quality, as if their flesh had become somehow less substantial than normal human tissue. Their pulse rates had slowed to levels that should have indicated severe medical distress, yet they continued to function with apparent normalcy. Most disturbing was his observation that several of the long-term residents appeared to require significantly less food than would be necessary to sustain human life, subsisting on rations that should have resulted in starvation within weeks. The island's workshops, originally intended for the production of textiles and other goods that could be sold to support the facility's operations, began to produce items of an entirely different nature. The women worked with materials that Dr. Blackthorne could not identify, weaving fabrics from fibers that seemed to shimmer with their own internal light. The finished products bore patterns that hurt the eyes to examine directly, geometric designs that seemed to shift and writhe when observed for extended periods. These items were carefully packed and shipped to destinations that Administrator Thornbury refused to specify in his official records. The arrival of supply ships became increasingly infrequent as word of the island's peculiar nature spread among the maritime community. Captains who had previously made regular runs to Whitaker Island began to refuse the assignments, claiming that their crews experienced severe psychological distress during visits to the island. Those who did continue to service the facility reported that the women who loaded and unloaded cargo moved with an eerie silence, completing their tasks with mechanical efficiency while maintaining expressions of vacant contentment that unnerved even the most hardened sailors. Jeremiah, the lighthouse keeper, began to feature more prominently in Dr. Blackthorne's observations during this period. The doctor noted that the mysterious keeper seemed to exercise some form of authority over the island's female population, though the nature of his influence remained unclear. The women would cease their activities whenever Jeremiah appeared, standing motionless until he had passed from view. Dr. Blackthorne's attempts to approach the lighthouse for a closer examination of its keeper were consistently thwarted by mechanical failures of his equipment or sudden onset of severe headaches that forced him to retreat. The doctor's final entries from the winter of 1847 described dreams that plagued not only himself, but apparently every resident of the island. These nocturnal visions involved vast underwater cities populated by beings that defied description, places where the normal laws of physics held no sway, and time flowed in directions that human minds could not comprehend. Upon waking, the dreamers retained only fragments of these visions, but the cumulative effect was a growing sense that Whitaker Island served as some form of gateway to realms that existed beyond the boundaries of human understanding. The spring of 1848 marked the beginning of what Administrator Thornbury's encrypted correspondence would later refer to as the commercial phase of Whitaker Island's operations. The rehabilitation facility's official purpose began to serve as mere camouflage for activities that bore no resemblance to moral reformation. Ships began arriving under cover of darkness, their manifests listing cargo that bore no relation to the supplies necessary for maintaining a women's correctional facility. These vessels flew flags of convenience from various maritime nations, their crews sworn to secrecy through contracts that promised substantial compensation for discretion and severe penalties for betrayal. Dr. Blackthorne's medical journals from this period documented his growing horror at the transformation of his patients into something that could no longer be classified as entirely human. The women's physical appearance had stabilized into an unsettling perfection that seemed to transcend natural beauty. Their skin had acquired a luminescent quality that was most apparent in dim lighting, while their movements had become fluid and graceful in ways that suggested their bones and muscles had been fundamentally altered. Most disturbing was their apparent immunity to fatigue, pain, and the normal limitations of human endurance. The island's new visitors arrived with the regularity of a commercial enterprise, though the nature of their business remained carefully obscured in official records. These men represented the colonial elite, wealthy merchants, government officials, military officers, and members of the aristocracy who traveled great distances to reach Whitaker Island's remote location. They came bearing letters of introduction from sources that Administrator Thornbury never identified. Documents that granted them access to facilities and services that existed nowhere in the official operational guidelines for the rehabilitation center. The lighthouse keeper Jeremiah emerged as a central figure in these nocturnal proceedings, serving as both host and coordinator for the island's mysterious commercial activities. Dr. Blackthorne observed that Jeremiah possessed an uncanny ability to anticipate the arrival of ships hours before they appeared on the horizon, as if he maintained some form of supernatural communication with vessels approaching the island. The keeper's physical appearance had remained unchanged throughout the doctor's tenure on the island, maintaining the same ageless quality that characterized many of the island's long-term female residents. The women's behavior during these visits revealed the true extent of their transformation. They moved through their interactions with the island's guests with mechanical precision, displaying an unnatural ability to anticipate and fulfill desires that had not been explicitly expressed. Their responses seemed programmed rather than spontaneous, Marna, as if they had been reduced to elaborate automatons designed to provide specific forms of entertainment and companionship. Yet beneath this artificial compliance, Dr. Blackthorne detected something that might have been consciousness, trapped and screaming behind eyes that had been rendered incapable of expressing genuine emotion. The island's physical environment began to respond to these activities in ways that defied natural explanation. The limestone buildings seemed to absorb and retain the sounds of human activity, creating an acoustic environment where whispers could be heard echoing through corridors hours after they had been spoken. The cultivated fields produced crops that bore no resemblance to the seeds that had been planted, yielding fruits and vegetables with properties that Dr. Blackthorne hesitated to document in his official medical reports. Administrator Thornbury's private correspondence revealed his awareness that the island's operations had evolved far beyond their original scope, though he seemed powerless to alter their trajectory. His letters to colonial superiors described a situation that had acquired its own momentum, driven by forces that he could neither understand nor control. The financial returns from the island's commercial activities had become substantial enough to attract attention from the highest levels of colonial government, creating a web of complicity that made any attempt at intervention politically impossible. The visitors themselves began to exhibit changes after their stays on Whitaker Island. Dr. Blackthorne noted that many returned repeatedly, displaying an addiction-like compulsion to experience whatever services the island provided. Their physical appearance gradually acquired some of the same translucent quality that characterized the island's permanent residents, while their behavior became increasingly erratic and disconnected from normal social conventions. Several prominent colonial officials were observed to have developed peculiar speech patterns and mannerisms that seemed to mirror those of the island's female population. The doctor's attempts to document these phenomena were hampered by the deterioration of his own mental faculties. His handwriting became increasingly illegible, while his medical observations took on a fevered quality that suggested his scientific objectivity had been compromised by prolonged exposure to the island's malign influence. His final coherent entries from this period described a growing certainty that Whitaker Island served as a conduit for forces that existed beyond the boundaries of human comprehension, entities that fed upon human suffering and degradation while maintaining the facade of a legitimate commercial enterprise. The spring of 1848 concluded with the arrival of a ship that carried no identifying marks or flags, its crew consisting entirely of individuals whose faces seemed to shift and blur when observed directly, as if they existed only partially within the realm of normal human perception. The summer of 1848 witnessed the complete abandonment of any pretense that Whitaker Island served a rehabilitative purpose. Dr. Blackthorne's medical records from this period documented transformations that challenged the very definition of human existence. The women who had once been prisoners of moral circumstance had become something altogether different, their humanity systematically stripped away and replaced with a terrible perfection that served purposes beyond mortal comprehension. Their bodies had acquired an otherworldly resilience that allowed them to endure experiences that would have destroyed ordinary flesh, while their minds had been hollowed out and refilled with programming that responded to desires too dark for civilized society to acknowledge. The island's architecture began to reflect its true nature during these months. New structures appeared overnight, built from materials that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. These buildings possessed geometries that hurt the mind to contemplate, with corridors that led to rooms larger than the structures that contained them, and staircases that descended far deeper into the earth than the island's limestone foundation should have permitted. The original rehabilitation compound had been transformed into a labyrinthine complex designed to cater to appetites that grew increasingly exotic and disturbing as the summer progressed. Administrator Thornbury's correspondence revealed his complete capitulation to forces beyond his control. His reports to colonial authorities had become exercises in creative fiction, describing a model rehabilitation facility that bore no resemblance to the nightmare that Whitaker Island had become. The financial returns from the island's operations had grown so substantial that they attracted investment from sources that Thornbury dared not identify in official documents. Money flowed through accounts in multiple countries, creating a financial web that made the island's true ownership impossible to determine. The visitors who arrived during this period represented a different class of clientele than the colonial officials and wealthy merchants who had previously patronized the island's services. These new guests traveled in ships that flew no flags and carried passengers whose identities were protected by layers of anonymity that suggested involvement at the highest levels of international power. They came seeking experiences that could not be obtained anywhere else in the civilized world, drawn by rumors of pleasures that transcended the normal limitations of human flesh and spirit. Dr. Blackthorne's observations of these proceedings revealed the true horror of what the island had become. The women performed their duties with mechanical precision, their bodies capable of enduring treatment that would have killed ordinary humans within minutes. Their faces maintained expressions of serene contentment, even during experiences that should have produced screams of agony, as if their capacity for suffering had been surgically removed while leaving their physical forms intact. The doctor noted that their eyes had acquired a quality that suggested consciousness had been replaced by something that merely mimicked awareness while serving entirely different masters. The lighthouse keeper Jeremiah emerged as the true architect of the island's transformation, though his exact nature remained beyond Dr. Blackthorne's ability to comprehend. The keeper moved through the island's facilities with proprietorial confidence, overseeing operations that seemed to follow schedules determined by astronomical events rather than human convenience. His presence appeared to be essential for the island's continued function, as the women became increasingly agitated during his rare absences, their programming apparently requiring his proximity to maintain stability. The island's natural environment had been completely subverted to serve its new purpose. The surrounding waters had acquired a phosphorescent quality that made navigation treacherous for vessels not specifically invited to approach. The limestone cliffs had been carved with symbols that seemed to shift and change when observed from different angles, creating a visual language that conveyed meaning directly to the subconscious mind while bypassing rational thought. The very air had become thick with influences that affected perception and judgment, making it impossible for visitors to maintain clear memories of their experiences once they departed the island. Dr. Blackthorn's final coherent medical entries described his growing realization that he had become complicit in activities that violated not merely human law, but the fundamental order of existence itself. His attempts to document the island's true nature were hampered by the deterioration of his own sanity, as prolonged exposure to the island's influence had begun to affect his ability to distinguish between reality and nightmare. His handwriting became increasingly erratic, while his observations took on a quality that suggested he was recording events from within a dream that had acquired the weight of physical reality. The summer concluded with the arrival of a delegation whose ship bore markings that Dr. Blackthorn recognized from his studies of ancient maritime symbols, though he could not recall where he had encountered them before. These visitors brought with them artifacts that seemed to pulse with their own internal light, objects that the island's transformed inhabitants regarded with something approaching reverence. The autumn of 1848 brought revelations that shattered Dr. Blackthorn's remaining vestiges of scientific rationality. His medical journals from this period documented discoveries that challenged not merely his understanding of human physiology, but the very foundations of reality itself. The artifacts brought by the mysterious delegation had been installed throughout the island's facilities, creating a network of objects that seemed to pulse with synchronized rhythms that matched no known biological or mechanical pattern. These devices, if they could be called such, appeared to serve as conduits for influences that originated from sources beyond the boundaries of terrestrial existence. The women of Whitaker Island had undergone their final transformation during these months, evolving beyond any recognizable form of humanity while maintaining the external appearance of physical perfection. Dr. Blackthorn's examinations revealed that their internal anatomy had been fundamentally altered, with organs that served functions he could not begin to comprehend. Their hearts beat in patterns that corresponded to no known cardiac rhythm, while their blood had acquired properties that defied chemical analysis. Most disturbing was his discovery that they no longer required sustenance in any conventional sense, drawing their energy from sources that seemed to exist outside the normal flow of time and space. The island's true purpose became apparent through documents that Administrator Thornbury had attempted to destroy, but which survived in fragmentary form within his personal effects. Whitaker Island served as a testing ground for techniques designed to transform human consciousness into something that could interface directly with entities that existed beyond the veil of ordinary perception. The women had become living conduits, their minds hollowed out and refilled with programming that allowed them to serve as bridges between the human world and realms that operated according to entirely different laws of existence. The lighthouse keeper Jeremiah revealed himself to be something far more ancient and terrible than Dr. Blackthorn had previously suspected. The keeper's true form became visible during certain astronomical alignments, when the barriers between dimensions grew thin enough to permit glimpses of his actual nature. He appeared as a composite being, part human and part something that had never been human, his consciousness spanning multiple planes of existence simultaneously. His role as keeper extended far beyond the maintenance of the lighthouse beacon, encompassing the coordination of activities that affected the fundamental structure of reality itself. The visitors who patronized the island's services were revealed to be participants in a vast conspiracy that extended throughout the colonial world and beyond. Their activities on Whitaker Island served purposes that transcended mere physical gratification, involving rituals that transferred aspects of their humanity to the entities that controlled the island's operations. Each visit left them diminished in ways that were not immediately apparent, their souls gradually consumed by forces that fed upon human essence while leaving their bodies intact enough to continue functioning in normal society. Dr. Blackthorne's investigations uncovered evidence that Whitaker Island was merely one node in a network of similar facilities that existed throughout the world's remote regions. These installations served as anchor points for influences that sought to establish permanent footholds within the human realm, using transformed human consciousness as the medium through which they could exert their will upon terrestrial affairs. The women of Whitaker Island had become unwitting soldiers in a war that most of humanity remained unaware was being fought. The island's physical structure had been revealed to extend far deeper into the earth than surface observations had suggested. Subterranean chambers carved from living rock housed machinery that operated according to principles that violated known laws of physics. These devices generated fields of influence that affected the behavior of matter and energy within the island's vicinity, creating localized distortions in the fabric of reality that allowed entities from other dimensions to manifest within the physical world. The Doctor's own transformation had accelerated during this period, as prolonged exposure to the island's influences began to affect his fundamental nature. His perception of time had become fluid, with past and future events appearing to occur simultaneously within his consciousness. His physical form remained largely unchanged, but his mind had begun to operate according to patterns that bore little resemblance to normal human thought processes. He found himself able to perceive aspects of reality that had previously been invisible, though this expanded awareness came at the cost of his ability to function within conventional frameworks of understanding. The autumn concluded with the arrival of a ship that carried no living crew, its deck populated by figures that cast no shadows and left no footprints upon the wooden planking. These entities brought with them the final components necessary for the completion of whatever project had been underway since the island's establishment. Devices that would transform Whitaker Island from a testing ground into a permanent gateway between worlds. The winter of 1848 brought the culmination of forces that had been gathering around Whitaker Island since its discovery. Dr. Blackthorne's final coherent medical entries documented phenomena that transcended the boundaries between the physical and metaphysical realms. The installation of the shadowless entities' devices had triggered a fundamental alteration in the island's relationship with reality itself. Time began to flow in directions that defied human comprehension, with events occurring simultaneously across multiple temporal planes while maintaining a terrifying internal consistency that suggested the presence of an intelligence vast beyond mortal understanding. The women of Whitaker Island had achieved their ultimate transformation, becoming living embodiments of desires that existed beyond the scope of human imagination. Their forms had acquired a fluidity that allowed them to reshape themselves according to the needs of each encounter. Their consciousness distributed across multiple dimensional planes while maintaining perfect coordination with their physical manifestations. Dr. Blackthorne observed that they had become conduits for experiences that drew upon the deepest recesses of human psychology, fulfilling appetites that their visitors had never consciously acknowledged possessing. The island's architecture had evolved into a structure that existed partially outside normal space, with rooms that opened onto vistas of alien landscapes and corridors that led to destinations that could not be reached by conventional travel. The lighthouse had become the focal point of this dimensional instability, its beacon now casting light that illuminated regions of existence that lay beyond the visible spectrum. Jeremiah's true nature as a guardian of interdimensional gateways became apparent as he orchestrated the final phases of the island's transformation with the precision of an entity that had performed similar operations across countless worlds. Administrator Thornbury's final reports revealed his complete surrender to forces that had rendered human authority meaningless. His correspondence with colonial superiors had become exercises in deliberate obfuscation, designed to maintain the illusion of governmental oversight while concealing the reality that Whitaker Island had become an autonomous entity operating according to laws that superseded terrestrial jurisdiction. The financial networks that supported the island's operations had evolved into a self-sustaining system that drew resources from sources that existed outside normal economic frameworks. The visitors who arrived during this period represented the culmination of a selection process that had been operating throughout human history. These individuals had been identified and cultivated across generations, their bloodlines carefully maintained to produce consciousness capable of interfacing with the entities that controlled the island's operations. Their participation in the island's activities served purposes that extended far beyond personal gratification, involving the transfer of essential human qualities to beings that sought to understand and ultimately subsume terrestrial existence. Dr. Blackthorn's transformation had reached a critical threshold, his consciousness expanding to encompass awareness of the vast network of similar installations that existed throughout the world. He perceived Whitaker Island as merely one component of a global infrastructure designed to facilitate the gradual integration of human civilization into a larger cosmic order. His medical training had become irrelevant as he developed the ability to perceive the fundamental forces that governed the interaction between different planes of existence. The island's influence had begun to extend beyond its physical boundaries, affecting weather patterns and maritime traffic throughout the North Atlantic region. Ships reported encountering phantom vessels that appeared and disappeared without warning, while coastal communities experienced dreams that seemed to originate from external sources. The lighthouse's beacon had become visible from distances that should have been impossible given the curvature of the Earth, its light penetrating fog and storm with supernatural clarity. The women's activities had evolved beyond the provision of physical services to encompass the facilitation of experiences that transform their visitors at the molecular level. Each encounter involved the careful extraction and refinement of human essence, which was then processed through mechanisms that existed partially within the island's subterranean chambers and partially within dimensions that operated according to entirely different physical laws. The visitors departed the island fundamentally altered, carrying within themselves seeds of transformation that would gradually reshape human society according to patterns determined by intelligences that had been observing terrestrial development for millennia. The winter solstice of 1848 marked the completion of the island's metamorphosis from a human institution into something that transcended terrestrial categories entirely. The barriers between dimensions had been permanently weakened, creating a stable gateway through which entities from other realms could observe and influence human affairs with unprecedented directness. Dr. Blackthorn's final medical entry consisted of a single observation that captured the magnitude of what had been accomplished: the successful creation of a permanent interface between human consciousness and cosmic forces that had previously existed beyond the reach of terrestrial perception. The transformation was complete, and Whitaker Island had become something that would continue to operate long after its human creators had been forgotten by history. The spring of 1849 brought no renewal to Whitaker Island, for the concept of seasonal change had become meaningless within its transformed boundaries. Dr. Blackthorne's final entries, discovered decades later in a sealed chamber beneath the lighthouse, documented the complete dissolution of linear time within the island's sphere of influence. Past, present, and future had collapsed into a singular eternal moment where all possibilities existed simultaneously, creating a temporal paradox that allowed the island to draw upon resources and knowledge from across the entirety of human history. The women who had once been prisoners of moral circumstance had achieved a form of immortality that transcended both life and death. Their consciousness had been distributed across multiple dimensional planes, allowing them to exist as eternal servants to desires that spanned the breadth of human experience and beyond. Dr. Blackthorne observed that they had become living repositories of every form of pleasure and pain that had ever been conceived by mortal minds. Their transformed bodies capable of manifesting experiences that drew upon the collective unconscious of the entire human species. The island's final visitors arrived not through conventional maritime travel, but through dimensional gateways that connected Whitaker Island to similar installations throughout the cosmos. These entities bore no resemblance to terrestrial life forms, their consciousness operating according to principles that had evolved across eons of existence within realms where matter and energy followed entirely different laws. Their presence on the island served to complete a transformation that had been orchestrated across multiple civilizations and countless worlds, establishing Whitaker Island as a permanent nexus point within a vast network of interdimensional facilities. Administrator Thornbury's fate became apparent through documents that materialized within his former office, despite the physical impossibility of their creation. His consciousness had been absorbed into the island's collective intelligence, his administrative skills repurposed to coordinate activities that spanned multiple planes of existence simultaneously. His human identity had been preserved as a functional component within a larger organizational structure that managed the flow of consciousness and energy between dimensions, ensuring the continued operation of the island's facilities across all temporal and spatial boundaries. The lighthouse keeper Jeremiah revealed his true nature as an eternal guardian, whose duties extended far beyond the maintenance of a single beacon. His consciousness encompassed awareness of similar installations throughout the universe, each serving as an anchor point for influences that sought to establish permanent footholds within the physical realm. The lighthouse had become a communication hub through which these entities coordinated their activities across vast distances of space and time, its beacon serving as both a navigational aid and a transmission device for signals that operated beyond the electromagnetic spectrum. Dr. Blackthorne's transformation had reached its ultimate conclusion. His human consciousness expanded to encompass awareness of the cosmic forces that governed the interaction between different planes of existence. His medical knowledge had evolved into an understanding of the fundamental principles that governed the manipulation of consciousness and matter across dimensional boundaries. His final entries described the successful completion of an experiment that had been conducted across multiple civilizations, each contributing essential components to a project whose scope encompassed the gradual transformation of physical reality itself. The island's influence had begun to manifest within the dreams and unconscious thoughts of individuals throughout the civilized world, seeding human consciousness with concepts and desires that would gradually reshape society according to patterns determined by intelligences that operated beyond terrestrial comprehension. The visitors who had patronized the island's services served as unwitting carriers of this influence, their transformed consciousness spreading the island's effects throughout the networks of power and influence that controlled human civilization. The documents discovered within the Portsmouth Maritime Archives concluded with observations that suggested Whitaker Island continued to operate long after its official abandonment by colonial authorities. Ships reported sighting the island's lighthouse beacon during storms, its light providing guidance to vessels that found themselves lost within temporal anomalies that transported them across decades or centuries in the span of a single night. These encounters left crews with fragmented memories of experiences that seemed to occur outside the normal flow of time, their consciousness briefly interfacing with the island's eternal operations before returning them to their original temporal coordinates. The final entry in Dr. Blackthorne's medical journal consisted of a warning addressed to future researchers who might discover the island's records. He cautioned that knowledge of Whitaker Island's true nature carried with it the risk of mental contamination, as awareness of the island's operations created a psychic connection that could draw the observer into its sphere of influence across any distance of space or time. The island's transformation had been so complete that it existed as much within the realm of ideas as within physical reality, its influence spreading through the simple act of contemplating its existence. The horrible story of Whitaker Island had become eternal, its effects rippling through human consciousness across generations, forever altering the hidden currents that shaped the development of terrestrial civilization. Thank you for joining us for another episode of Sinister Memory. If you enjoyed today's investigation, subscribe to our channel and ring the notification bell to be alerted when we unveil our next dark chronicle. Share your thoughts about this case in the comments below. We read every single one, and your ideas often lead us to our next investigation. Until next time.